Bob and I are really delighted to welcome you here today for this really special opportunity to hear Lita Judge, who is, as you know, an amazing author. I asked Corinne to bring some of her books from the library. I thought we should be surrounded by her truly amazing work. More than 26 works, now probably 28, now probably 30 works of fiction and nonfiction that have been published for children of all ages. And they really are wonderful. Of course, she's an illustrator as well and gets into her books through the illustration. I first heard Lita speak at the library, of course. She was talking about her book, Mary's Monster, which if you haven't had a chance to see it, is truly remarkable. A book of illustrations and the story of Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. And as a college professor, I taught Frankenstein for a long time. So reading this was great. And I thought, by way of introduction to Lita, because she will tell you about her life, I'd just take a couple of phrases. This book is written in free verse with complete page illustrations that are truly remarkable. And it traces Mary Shelley's life. And thinking about her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, who was an early writer on women's rights, Lita writes, in the voice of Mary Shelley. My mother challenged a world of angry men with the soft feather of her pen. Bayonets and cannons weren't her weapons of war. She chose words alone to begin her revolt. Her words were formed by courage. Her stories were her victories. And later in the book, just one other little bit, at the end, Mary reflecting on her life and the fact that her book was received eventually very, very well. She writes at the end, I feel redeemed. This is in the voice of Mary Shelley. My creation stands on the threshold of immortality. We can affect the lives of generations to come if we are brave enough to open the wings of our imagination and create. Lita opens the wings of imagination for all of us, and through the library and through her artistry and her incredible imagination, we're able to travel with her. So we welcome Lita today.
So it's my honor to speak here, and I just want to express my deepest gratitude to all of you who are working so hard to give to our library and ensure that this is a place of beauty and creativity and imagination for all of those in our community. It was not a given that I would become a writer and an illustrator. If you had met me long ago when I was a child, in fact, I think you would be incredibly surprised at what led me to becoming a writer and illustrator. And it was only through the work of libraries that I found my path. I'm often asked by parents who want to support their kids in becoming writers or artists, what should we do? What should we get them private lessons, art lessons before they go off to art school? And they ask me for all this advice, and I really don't know what to say other than take them to the library, drop them off, and let them alone. Everything they need to become an artist is at the library. I myself did not go to art school. It was a roundabout path to becoming an artist, but it was the library that brought me to it. I was born on an island off the coast of Alaska. It was an uninhabited island. My family lived there in a tent. My dad was a soil scientist, and by the nature of his work, we had to travel to remote areas that had never been mapped or civilized before. So I grew up in a very isolated location. I was not exposed to books as a child. My mom I had a twin sister, and that was my only community, was my twin and I. My mom used to have to cook our food over a fire, wash our clothes in a stream, and to do all the chores that she needed to do while living on a remote island. She would tie us to a tree, and the two of us would spend hours tied to a tree. And we would chat away in our toddler talk, and stories became a really big part of our life. My sister was a very impatient tree nester. She wanted to go off and play, and she would become very unsettled, and so I would tell her stories. And stories became a really important part, and eventually imaginary friends became a very important part of my life because I lived on an island with a twin that was having a lot of difficulty living there, and so often I would play with the friends that I created through my imagination. My dad was the kind of guy that was really focused and driven on his work, but as we got a little older, we would often accompany him on his mapping projects. But he was the kind of guy that if he was off mapping, part of his work was that he would dig these holes that were about this wide and up to 6 feet deep. And he would test all the different layers of the soil. And that was his focus. And when we would accompany him in the field, sometimes we were going through terrain that he had already been through, and he was testing how the soil drained and everything. And I would inadvertently step into a hole, and these holes were so tight that you would fall in and be pinned. Your arms would be pinned. And I learned pretty quickly that Dad was not going to realize I was stuck in a hole for a number of hours. And so again, stories became an vital part of my life, because when you're pinned in a hole up to your head, you can either panic or you can create a story. And so stories became a really rich part of my life. Eventually we moved to the mainland, and we lived in a town where there were people our own age that went to school. But by then it was actually a really rough transition for me, because I hadn't gone to school. I hadn't been surrounded with kids my own age. So I didn't speak correctly. I had to go to speech. They marched me down to speech therapy lab immediately. My sister and I didn't wear the right clothes. We didn't go to the right church. We didn't have the activities. We didn't know how to play sports. There were a lot of things that we didn't do, so we didn't fit in. And so it was quite an adjustment. This town, though it was big enough to have a school, it was not big enough to have a library. But eventually, one day, a bookmobile came to our town. It was one of those silver Aerostars. And I stepped into that Aerostar not knowing exactly what a bookmobile was, but they had books of everything. And they had a lot of how-to books. A lot of people had to be pretty crafty when you live far from town. But there was a small section of children's books. And I was 12, and so I picked up a book, Witch of Blackberry Pond, and I read it, took it home and I read it. And I loved it. I read it again and again. I read it 3 times before I had to return it. And inside those pages, I discovered the character Kit, who was like me. She was an outsider, forced to live in a strange land, and she was treated differently because of that. And this book taught me how to navigate the world. It taught me how to cope. It taught me how to make sense of all of this. It gave me a companion who taught me that my differences were my strength, and that I needed to learn how to fit in, but I didn't need to give up the differences. I didn't need to give up what was special about me. She taught me this. When I went back to the bookmobile and the book was due, I tried to return it and get another book, but that book meant so much to me, I checked it out again. And I read it again and again until it became part of my bloodstream. Eventually the bookmobile came back. I needed to check it in. I couldn't check it in. I checked it out again. And I lived with this book. I carried it. I put it under my cover. I thought that this book was the only book in the world that understood me. And it was my guide. And the 4th time the bookmobile came to town, I tried to check it out again, and the librarian there, who was very kind, she said, "I'm not going to let you check out this book. You have to check something else out." And she forced the book out of my hand, and she made me check another book out. And the way she did it was she said, "But I have a gift for you." And she had bought me a copy of the book to take home, which this is the book. So then I read a different book alongside of Witch of Blackberry Pond, and I realized there were other stories that understood me and made sense of the world. And so then I became a reader, which was the most beautiful gift anybody has ever given to me, was to allow me to become a reader. And so I began to live in the library, or at first the bookmobile, eventually our town got a very, very small library. But along that time, my sister had really gotten off the path. She wasn't a reader. She didn't have the gift of the stories. And our family had really struggled with the transition of moving to population, and had by then pretty much dissolved. I was living with another family, and I was young, but I was okay because I had stories in my life. And they had made such a huge difference to me. So fast forward many years later, I realized when I thought about this book, I realized that the character Kit wasn't the only force that was in this book. there was another character in this story that came to life through all these multiple readings, and that was Elizabeth herself, the writer. When I was a child, I wanted to be Kit. I knew I couldn't go back to the 1600s and live in a settlement and be tried for a witch and go on and marry a pirate and live a fantastic adventure, although I did find somebody who took me on fantastic adventures. But I realized what I wanted was to be the woman behind the story, somebody who was courageous enough and brave enough and generous enough to share her imagination with others. I wanted to be Elizabeth George Spear. I wanted to move to New England and write children's books the rest of my life. And so on one day 15 years ago, my husband and I were talking, and I said, the only thing I want to do is write children's books. And we moved to this beautiful town, and the very first thing we did was we got a library card. And there was this beautiful children's book section. We actually got a card for the Peterborough Library and the Hancock Library because I was greedy for stories and I needed as many as I could find. And the second gift that a library gave to me came through the Peterborough Library, because all those years I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't know how to go about it. And the children's book section here was so wonderful. And Lisa, the librarian, every time I'd go, I said, do you have a book about this? And she'd put the right book in my hands. And the book that she put in my hands then was Out of the Dust by Karen Hess, which was so beautifully written. I no longer wanted to let fear drive the boat. I wanted to write my own children's book. And that was 1,000 Tracings. That was my first book. I wrote that, and by the time that book came out, I had written 5 more, and now I've written 29, I think it is. And Dave quit his job to be an engineer, and we travel all over the country and talk to schools and libraries, and we talk to thousands and thousands of kids every year, hoping that to make that connection between the stories that live in their minds and the books that they're reading, and for them to understand the stories that live in their minds are the same as the stories that their books that they're reading. They come from the same place and the same heart, and try to get them to understand that all you have to do is listen to those stories and put them down on the paper. So I'm incredibly grateful for librarians and libraries and all that they can do. They really saved me as a child. And every time we support a library and keep the doors of a library a rich and safe and beautiful place, we are giving kids an opportunity for a different path in life that maybe they wouldn't be able to see themselves unless they can visualize themselves on the cover of the books. So thank you for letting me share my story with the library, and thank you for putting so much effort into supporting our library. These libraries, they really matter. So thank you.
Corinne is here to tell us a little bit about what's going on at the Peterborough Library, and she doesn't need an introduction, so I'll just ask her to come up.
Thank you, Lita, for sharing so generously your story. That was super inspiring, and that's going to feed me for a long time.
Great.
Just put this down. So it's a very exciting time to be the library director in Peterborough. We are in this momentous transition period where we have this new building in the works, and yet it's our job to act now, to really research and look into what services and programs does our community need today so that we can build those and set a firm foundation so the new building we can grow into it and be kind of off to the races when we get the spaces that a modern library really requires. Some of the areas that we've been focusing, I want to tell you specifically tonight about young adult services. So in 2015, the staff and I realized or had a reckoning with the fact that we had no young adult area. And every public library that you go in across the country, if you walk into a public library, there is a young adult area, because does anyone have a teen here or has survived teens? Teens have unique needs. They need their own space. They have their own way of communicating, and right. And they deserve their own area. Space is power. So when a teen walks into our library and they have no space for them, that was sending a message to them that they weren't important and that we weren't interested in serving them. So we decided we're going to carve out a space. I don't care if it's 4 feet by 4 feet. We're calling it young adult. The space is more like 12 by 20 feet. It's very small, but it's cozy. It's well decorated. Has great funky furniture. And we put that space in place, and we messaged to our teens that you are welcome here. Please come, use your collection, be part of this community. A couple weeks ago, we started having this little group of boys that discovered the library and discovered that they could bike there and they could come after school by themselves. And so they started visiting the library, which was great, and they like to use the public computers because they like to game. And we noticed that there was a little bit of a conflict happening between the young teen users and our everyday adults that were there to do whatever they were doing. And so we worked with the boys to help them understand, the behavior policy and the noise levels and that thing, and they were superb, very well behaved. And there's still this tension. And we had this conversation among our staffers and with our adult patrons that basically said, why would it be more important to have an adult have this computer for an hour to check their Facebook or whatnot? And why is that more important than this teen's right to use this computer to do their game for an hour? Everyone's following the rules. We're not going to kick the teens out so that there's more space. That's a conflict that we can resolve a different way. Because no matter what, we want to make sure that our teens feel welcome. So we resolved that. It went beautifully. And a couple of weeks later, this is actually just last week, I opened the library on Tuesday mornings. And I opened the library, and this little fella came in, one of the boys, and it's about 10 o'clock. And I said, hey, buddy, how you doing today? How come you're not in school? And he said, well, I woke up this morning, and I missed the bus. And his mom wasn't home, so he gave her a call, and she said, well, you're going to have to stay home. Just stay home today. So he packed a lunch, and he came to the library. And I said, great, I'm glad you're here. Let me know what you need today. You can hang out with us. And he said, can I have some headphones? And so I passed him the headphones, and then I said, I have a challenge for you. And I walked him into his area, and I said, before you sit down and game, why don't you pick a book and read for 10 minutes. And I really wasn't sure what he was going to say, but he just said, okay. So he picked a book, and he sat down, and he read for a half hour. And then he checked the book out. And he did stay the whole day. He gamed. He also went over to our maker space, and he did, the activity that we had out. And he's been a very frequent visitor because it's obvious. It's obvious that there's not an adult home a lot in his home, and so he's found the library as a safe place for him to be. And that's just one reason why the library is so vital to our community. We're a connection point, and library use sort of happens on a continuum. You might use it when you're a young mom and you need a place to be with your kids. You might use it when you're looking for a job and you need career development help, and we help you get that resume ready. And you might use it when you're a little boy and your mom's not home and you have nowhere to be. So that's why I'm so passionate about what I do and why I think this project's so important. And I want to just thank you all so much for being here, for supporting our project, for spreading the word about it. And I guess I'll turn it back over to Tori, who's just going to say the closing remarks.
Okay, thanks. We're so lucky to have her as our library director, aren't we? This is a library that was the first tax-supported public library in the world. It's the birthplace of an idea. And that idea is that books that provide life stories that connect you, that make you feel as if you're not the only person in the world who is thinking and feeling what you're thinking or experiencing what you're thinking, that belonged to all the people. The Peterborough Library's idea was that the library is owned by the people, it's supported by the people, for all of the people. I invite you here for 3 reasons. First, to thank you. Second, to say if you feel that you can make a deeper commitment to the library, I would invite you to do that. We have pledge forms, we have people from the 1833 Society. Bob and I are making it a deeper commitment because we think it's important that we get over this last hump. And if there are people, the third reason is if there are people that we should talk to that we haven't been able to reach, who don't know about this project and would like to support it and like to know about it, please let us know. Tina and Sandy and Ron and Audrey and Deb, all here, Corinne, can certainly follow up for you. And we won't out you, I promise. But I want to thank you for your support. It is just wonderful to be filled with in a room. And I want to thank you, Lita, for your inspiring words about the importance of libraries in young people's lives. So thank you all for being here. If you do want to make a deeper commitment, I can tell you it can be made over 2 years. It doesn't have to begin this year. You can make a pledge that starts next year. But we need you. The community needs you, and we need you now. We need to get this project started. So thank you for coming. There is tons of wine. There's so much food. Nobody came in here. You all hung around the bar. But the good food's in here. Please fill your glasses. Please stay. Enjoy Lita's books and enjoy the fellowship of other people who enjoy libraries. Thanks so much for coming.